if you're doing this job for any length of time, even calls that I recall going back in my career, newly engaged couple both killed in a auto crash, a van full of a family with five children coming back from a Christmas light display rolls over and they're all ejected, and none survived. When you see those, and obviously I wasn't the only responder on scene. There's a whole crew of first responders. When you see those, um, uh, just horrific life tragedies. And let's be honest. I mean, we get called 911, and most often we're parachuting into someone's life at the worst moment, and being expected to stabilize the event. So those take a toll. I mean, there's no way that you can any normal human can see that type of horrific um, life tragedy and not take some toll.
Well, welcome to the Fire Code Tech podcast, Todd. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you, Gus. Appreciate very much the opportunity to come on and have a great conversation with you today. I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. Well, I always like to get these podcasts started with telling the listeners a little bit about your background, Todd. Tell me about how you got started in fire and life safety and the fire service.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for asking that, Gus. I've had been blessed to have a great long career. So I actually started back when I was in high school. Believe it or not, I happened to be present when my grandmother had a medical emergency, and I watched in awe. I grew up in the age of Emergency, the TV show, Squad 51, Engine 51, and I saw these paramedics just descend on my grandparents' house, and it was actually a pretty critical emergency, and they were able to do their magic and stabilize her, and ultimately she had a wonderful outcome, and basically they saved her life. So made a tremendous impression on myself. I ended up going on to complete my emergency medical technician training. While I was still in high school, I then went to Northeastern University in Boston to complete my paramedic training. Worked for several years in emergency medical services up in the Massachusetts, New Hampshire area. And I had one what we called northeaster too many. That's when 24 inches, 26 inches, a couple feet of snow gets dumped, and said, this is a tough job to be doing as it is. So I'm going to head south. And that journey took me to South Florida, where I spent 30 years in the Broward County, Florida fire and rescue system, rising to the rank of the second in command. And was blessed to serve in many different roles, work my way up through the rank structure, and then watch that system grow. It's a county of about 2 million, 2.1 million outside of Greater Fort Lauderdale. The department today is about 900 members strong. And during my tenure there, I was also able to run for the board of directors of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, which I've served on their Safety, Health, and Survival Board for about the last 15 years. And I've also now served with the National Fire Protection Association on their occupational health standards committees. So I've been blessed. I retired about 3.5 years ago. Like I said, after 30 years of service, I failed retirement miserably. I got one day of golf and then the following day, I went to the private sector and I joined a company called LifeScan Wellness Centers, which is the nation's largest provider of firefighter and police physicals. So I'm a senior executive with that company, and allows me to continue to give back to the fire service.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing, Todd. And, just diving a little bit more in on that on your professional career, would you mind speaking to a couple of the specific roles that you held while you're in the fire service, just to give people a little bit more context of your background?
Sure. Sure, absolutely. So I worked, as mentioned, worked my way up the ranks in Broward County. So I worked the field, became company officer, a lieutenant, and then captain. So supervising units, providing EMS and fire response at combined systems, so firefighter, paramedic. Um, and then my career took me to staff. So I served in a number of different roles on staff, overseeing quality improvement for the emergency medical system. I was also the EMS chief, served a brief stint as the interim chief of training. Um, uh, Also was in charge of accreditation and professional standards. So I'm very proud to say I was able to work with a great team that led Broward County to be an internationally accredited department, one of only about 300 and some odd. And ultimately then became chief of operations. And again, that was probably the most challenging role that I had with a big metro department, but it was also one of the most rewarding. You were able to affect change, work with our labor organization to make sure that the men and women on the front line had the resources that they need to do the job and do it safely.
Awesome. I appreciate that background. Yeah, I'd like to set up the interview in that way so that people can get a sense of the individual and really kind of get your credibility going into these next couple topics that we're focusing on for the podcast. The first one, um, I understand you were in charge of presenting a couple different presentations on topics, or is that just through the company that you work with, Todd? But yeah, a couple of the different topics we're going to focus on for this podcast kind of center around NFPA 1500 and NFPA 1851, but give the listeners a little bit of background with these subjects and kind of what you've been doing recently.
Sure, absolutely. I've just been blessed to have a lot of great friends and colleagues. So through that, and at one example is our friends at Vector Solutions. They quite often reach out to myself as a subject matter expert. Uh, I've been conference speaking on topics of occupational health and firefighters for quite some time. I'm the editor of the fire engineering book, Surviving the Fire Service, in which myself and a number of co authors talk about some of the challenges that firefighters face with regards to their occupational health risk, such as cancer, post traumatic stress, behavioral wellness, sudden cardiac events. And those are all threats to our health as firefighters that we need to be managing and thinking about how we can protect ourselves from that risk. And as I mentioned, have been blessed to also be one of the technical committee members for the NFPA 1500 series. So NFPA being really the holy grail of the fire service in terms of helping set standards within the industry. So I'm one of the stakeholders that comes together, helps develop those standards. Of course, we take public input, but those are really the roadmap, if you will, for at least the basic, right? So oftentimes entities will go above and beyond, but NFPA helps guide us. And much like we talked about before we started taping, I have my own weekly podcast that I do with a colleague, and I think one of the obligations that comes with leadership and service is giving back. So I do a tremendous amount of speaking at industry conferences, publish fairly regularly within industry journals. and believe that increasing awareness on topics that I know we're going to cover today, such as cancer in firefighter behavioral wellness, that's how we kind of change. Being a change agent, I look at um, giving back. So educating, increasing awareness is part of the solution. Um, and sometimes we don't necessarily do as good a job in the fire service as I would like to see, and it's through efforts such as yourself doing podcasts like this with partners and friends like Vector Solutions that we can amplify, we can reach a larger audience working together. So those are key to me. It's the challenge to affect change is always translating strategy into execution, right? So if we have great, ideas about how to make the fire service healthier and safer, that's wonderful. That's where it starts. But then we have to make sure that we're able to translate that into changes at the tip of the spear on the front line to make sure we're seeing the greatest impact.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Todd, that it's easy to pontificate and muse about good ideas and feel good talking about it, but it is hard to put to action, systems and programs to actually get on the front line and help people. So I appreciate you touching on that point. I wanted to, touch more on this topic of NFPA 1500 and for the listeners, what is NFPA 1500 and how does it play a role in wellness for the fire service?
Sure, absolutely. So, um, NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, as I mentioned, is in essence a code council. So they set establish standards within the industry. The 1500 series in particular focuses on firefighter health and wellness. So there's different nuances within that series. Your listeners likely are most familiar in the NFPA 1582 being one of those standards, and that is it guides the medical evaluation of firefighters, how we look after medical exams and the type of medical exams that firefighters need to be available with, and then that whole series again covers topics such as personal protective gear and equipment. 1583, which covers our physical fitness and physical fitness. There's an infectious disease component of the 1500 series. It's a total picture, if you will, covering everything from physical wellness to fitness to on-scene safety. Of course, the PPE being a significant portion of that with 1851. So it's really all inclusive to make sure that we have the safest practical fire service that we're able to achieve, taking the best science and research that we have out there and using that knowledge base to then create standards to help guide departments.
Awesome. So, and for the listeners who don't know or who are in the car and can't Google it, NFPA 1500 is the standard on fire department occupational safety, health, and wellness program. And, it seems to me, or, in my brief time speaking with you, it seems to me that wellness for the fire service, resources for the service is a through line in what you're focusing on now. And in light of that, and on that topic, what kind of factors for behavioral wellness or, you talk about or you hear people talk about people struggling with different psychological, behavioral, or maybe workplace level stressors. What kind of factors should you be looking in your fellow fire service members who could potentially be at risk for some of these behavioral PTSD or some of these other kind of um, you know, uh, I don't know what to call them specifically. Yeah. You get what I'm saying. I don't know what the technical term is for these
You're
ailments.
spot on, and mental wellness and mental health is, the literature would document to us that the fire service and public safety in general is fraught with stressors that affect our mental well-being. So, having said that, that's what the research tells us. That a significant amount of first responders wrestle with anxiety, depression, substance dependency. Sleep is a huge underlying issue that drives that anxiety. On the far ends of the spectrum, unfortunately, we have far too many first responder suicides and attempted suicides. We don't have a good reporting system for those. So most folks would say they believe those are underreported. And I can tell you, practicality wise, from having done the job for 34 years, you're going to see things that you would never wish upon anyone else to have to see. Unfortunately, someone's got to see it. Someone's got to attempt to deal with the emergencies at hand. So, having said all that, then it becomes, we recognize there's a problem. It becomes then what is the solution? And I think the solution that we're at currently in the fire service is a couple, twofold, threefold. Is one, making sure we have early warning systems in place. So we know that certain events trigger response in people, whether that's a traumatic, a pediatric drowning or some traumatic and repetitive trauma. I think the literature says the more repeated the trauma that we see, the higher the rates of mental stressor that we have. So one is having early warning systems. Part of that, to be honest with you, is doing a better job with screening, behavioral health screenings. NFPA 1582 is just starting to address this. I know I just recently got back from a national stakeholders meeting in Memphis to look at what screenings should be incorporated for mental wellness into our annual physicals as firefighters. The International Association of Fire Chiefs did a survey back in 2016 showing only about 10% of firefighter physicals included any type of behavioral screening. I'm proud to say at LifeScan, and again, we're the nation's largest provider for firefighter and police physicals. We've incorporated screenings for sleep, for depression, so there's a mental wellness component of the physical. So we can screen for depression, we can screen for anxiety, and that's again the first step of recognizing someone struggling and be able to align them with resources. I will give a shout out to Vector Solutions, has done a fantastic job. They're actually offering free mental wellness training online that our industry can take and should take advantage of. PTSD, as an example, training. So again, I think the first part of it is early detection, intervention. There's a whole body of knowledge out there on resiliency and what's called post-traumatic growth. So teaching our firefighters positive coping skills, right? When I went to EMS training at the fire academy back in the day, we were never taught, what coping skills, healthy mechanisms to deal with the stresses of the job. So in the absence of that, many of us, default to unhealthy stressors. So, and then the last part, whether your department chief or labor leader on the volunteer side, is making sure you have the resources in place for firefighters. So we've got programs out there such as peer support training, where we actually train each other to recognize signs and symptoms of those that are struggling. And then be just a good listener, a good fellow first responder that has a little more training, that can listen when someone needs help, and guide them in the right direction to the resources that need to be available within the community. So huge issue. It's one I think still there's a stigma around. We don't talk about it enough, but it's there. It's hard reality, and one of the I mentioned sleep. We're finding that's a huge issue that affects not only behavioral wellness, but it also is linked to physical wellness as well. So, if we have erratic and poor sleep, we know we're at higher risk for significant occupational health concerns. But again, when I went to the academy, we never talked about healthy sleep. What does that mean? What does that look like? And there's a whole body of knowledge out there called sleep hygiene. That there's things we can do. Whether that's climate control, light control, get rid of the electronics in the bedroom. But we don't. We need to focus on those. So I want to put a plug in. Vector Solutions is offering some really great free training on this. So hopefully I've piqued a little interest in you and I in our discussion today. But if folks want to do a deeper dive, go take advantage of that free training. I mean, you don't get much in life for free, and when you have something as valuable that may save your life, it'd be a shame not to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that for free resources, actionable steps that somebody can take to, build some knowledge and have education around these really tough topics. But yeah, on the topic of resources, what other kind of resources? I know that you talked about, becoming educated on sleep hygiene and just trying to find community through your fire service and different aspects of the fire service. But what other resources would you promote for people to investigate if maybe they're struggling or they know somebody who may be struggling with these topics?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there's a old adage that I repeat often. There's no secrets in the fire service. So usually, we're a very tight knit community. What is going on in the fire station usually is known to all those at that station, and even beyond. So the first thing is identifying if someone is struggling, not be afraid to have that discussion. Think about if we were on the fire ground and we saw someone struggling. They call a mayday, but if we see someone struggling, we're going to help them. We have rapid intervention teams that's what they're designed to do, to assist firefighters that are in trouble. And we need to take that same concept to our interactions in general with each other to support. So the National Volunteer Fire Council has a significant amount of resources. The IFF on their website has a significant amount of behavioral health resources, both training programs. IFF actually has their own peer support teams that they mobilize and will send into a department. I know when I was in Broward, we reached out just to a local university that had a psychology department, Nova Southeastern University. I'll give them a plug. Large university in Broward County in Fort Lauderdale. And at no charge, they put together a beautiful awareness training similar to what Vector Solutions has. But they actually came in and trained our entire department on what is normal, what's abnormal, what are the signs to look for in someone that is struggling, and then what resources. And part of that is identifying, pre-identifying help within the community. Oftentimes, someone will be struggling and go to a licensed mental health professional who knows nothing about firefighters. So here in Florida, we've got the Florida Health and Safety Collaborative. They've actually spent an inordinate amount of time in training licensed mental health providers on what it means to be a firefighter, giving them a day in the life of a firefighter. So when we need to access their their clinical skills, they can see through the lens of a firefighter and what we're dealing with. It's not many professions that you see and are exposed to the repeated traumas that first responders are. So we need to make sure that we have our clinicians trained up in that. Because if we don't, what I've seen happen is a first responder will go to a clinician and then there's a disassociation. There's one doesn't understand what the other is seeing. So that's part of the resource solution is making sure we have all of our uh, first responders trained up to know when they are struggling and what's normal and not normal, because sometimes we fall into coping mechanisms that we can't see the struggle. We need to train each other to be comfortable with having difficult discussions and identifying folks that may need that lifeline, and then taking steps to make sure those resources in the community are available and trained up.
Todd, I appreciate that exposition on some different resources and just how important the identification and finding out that somebody is struggling. I think that is sounds like a really good topic for people to hear about. So it's something I didn't know about. So I know that if I'm in that boat and I work with fire service professionals all the time, then there are a lot of people out there who just don't know about this stuff. So I appreciate you bringing that information up.
Yeah, and thanks for asking too. And I'm not here to sell books at all, but one great resource, and the reason why we pulled a bunch of experts together to write it is "Surviving the Fire Service," and that's available on fireengineering.com. There's a whole chapter in there on behavioral wellness and what the challenges are and what the solutions are. So, but hopefully, I've given you a bunch of good resources for your listeners that are hearing this to reach out and don't reinvent the wheel. Take what's already out there and just implement.
Yeah, and this may be too difficult or a question or one you don't feel comfortable answering, Todd, but I always like to ask for people's personal accounts in technical topics and in life topics. But I don't know if you have. I'm sure you do, but if you don't want to share, just feel free to tell me no. But a personal account of how somebody has struggled with just these different ailments in the fire service, depression, PTSD, maybe that will help the listeners understand like a life application of how you've seen some of these things manifested. And you don't have to give names or anything, but I always like to bring a real world touch point so people can kind of digest it better.
Sure, absolutely. Just if you're doing this job for any length of time, even calls that I recall going back in my career, newly engaged couple both killed in a auto crash. A van full of a family with 5 children coming back from a Christmas light display rolls over and they're all ejected, and none survived. When you see those, and obviously I wasn't the only responder on scene, there's a whole crew of first responders. When you see those, um, uh, just horrific life tragedies. And let's be honest. I mean, we get called 911, and most often we're parachuting into someone's life at the worst moment, and being expected to stabilize the event. So those take a toll. I mean, there's no way that you can any normal human can see that type of horrific um, life tragedy and not take some toll, whether it's physically, anxiety, post traumatically, sleep disturbance from it, alcohol to blunt. So everyone handles it differently. A lot of people try to compartmentalize what they just saw, so they won't talk about it with family or outside the community of first responders. But we would be remiss to think that, again, those don't affect our mental well-being. The key, I think, that we've come to realize is, um, we're not going to stop the exposures as long as we have tragedy in this world and we have people that have to respond to it. We'll continue to see those images. What we need to do is make sure we have appropriate coping mechanisms taught in place. And it's simple stuff. I mean, we now have first responders being taught yoga. We have first responders being taught mindfulness. We have mindfulness apps on phones. Many of larger metro departments, City of Houston, as an example, and City of Raleigh just hired full-time department psychologists to actually be a resource. It's on staff with the fire department. So that's just a personal example. I could go on for the entire podcast of horrific calls and images. And like I said, I would not wish on anyone to see the images that I've seen. The unfortunate reality is, or fortunate, depending on how you look at it. The same with law enforcement, our men and women in the United States military when they're in combat. We need folks that are the tip of the spear and can protect our communities, both here and abroad. So we just need to make sure we have the right resources for them.
Well, Todd, I appreciate you sharing that. I can't imagine how hard that is to even say those things, but I appreciate you sharing that. I know that will touch somebody. Um, And so, you know, moving on kind of in the second phase or second topic that I wanted to cover for the interview, which is NFPA 1851. And it kind of centers more around fire service turnout gear and a full life cycle of care, maintenance, inspection, contaminant mitigation, and just the full life cycle of this gear. But yeah, I would love to hear you talk about. There's been a lot of talk recently in the community about fluorinated foam and contaminants for the fire service. And so I think this is a very current topic that people are thinking about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these, first off, these contaminants that are present on fire service gear.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, the bigger issue, right, is occupational fire service cancer, which drives this discussion. We know that I think the IFF has said that their memorial wall that names go up on, unfortunately, every year up in Colorado Springs, about 75% of those names are deaths from occupational cancer. And we know that we as firefighters have about a 9% overall higher rate of cancer than the general public. And part of that is carcinogen exposure. So we've got a couple issues. I'm sure when you're talking about chemicals, for our listeners, what does that mean? So there's one issue that's out there right now that the IFF is leading on, which is PFAS, actually chemicals that are in gear that firefighters get exposed to. The PFAS is in a lot of our world. So we're trying to figure out what does that look like. How do we move to PFAS free gear, protect our firefighters? The second issue with gear in firefight cancers, the gear that firefighters wear, commonly called bunker gear, was designed with the notion of protecting them from radiant heat. Not necessarily from protecting them from carcinogenic chemicals being on the gear. So, having said that, there's been some studies out there. Dr. Jeff Stull, one of the leading experts on PPE in the fire service, showing that the gear does not necessarily do a great job of blocking actual transmission of products of combustion getting onto the skin and then absorbed. So, having said that, becomes critical. We still need the gear because we're going into pressure cooker environments, high heat, high temperature. But now we're much more cognizant of getting the gear off of us quickly, getting our skin decontaminated quickly. And we've got point of contact resources such as decontamination wipes that the research have shown are very effective in wiping down the skin and removing some of those chemicals. But then we also have to do a better job with cleaning the gear, right? Because we've got exposure and carcinogens all over. I mean, products of combustion in there are literally hundreds, depending on what's inside, what's burning. Some of them we can measure and monitor for, others we can't. But the gear has to be immediately cleaned and make sure we get as much of that contaminant off. So there's there's guidance out there for immediate on-scene cleaning of the gear, scrubbing with a bristle brush, dry brush, hose down of the gear. And then we have standards that guide what we call advanced cleaning, where we actually send the gear out to a off-site, or it could be on-site, depending on the region. To an advanced cleaning to make sure that the gear is as safe as we can. So it's really an evolving issue. Many departments now are issuing their firefighters two sets of gear. So we can actually approach our decontamination of the gear very aggressively and still have a clean set to put on. So it's evolving. We've got here in Florida and elsewhere throughout the country departments now that have created mobile decontamination units. They actually respond to a scene with additional gear, with cleaning equipment, and they're actually doing it right on scene, because the quicker we can get this off, the less exposure we have that's being absorbed into the skin, and ultimately that's where we're getting the cancer from. I mentioned our friends at Vector Solutions, and I know we only have a short time today to scratch the surface on some of these topics, but another great awareness offering that they have is at no cost. They are providing cancer awareness training to firefighters. So again, Vector Solutions, in some of these issues, doing a deeper dive on what we know and then what we should be doing. So again, that's free training that's out there that I would encourage all of your listeners that are listening to this episode to reach out and avail themselves of that training on Vector Solutions website.
Yeah, and we can throw some links down to those free resources down in the show notes for people if they are interested in them. So we'll throw links to NFPA 851 and NFPA 1500, and then I'll try to grab as much of the links from what we talked about as possible and put those down in the show notes. And Todd, if you think of anything after the call that you want to send or anything like that, just let me know and I'll be sure to add those in for value for the listeners. Um, yeah, so I imagine that this topic is really evolving on a day-to-day basis for firefighters. I mean, there's a lot in here that I've not heard of, and I'm sure that has just been kind of really starting this system for decontamination and kind of contamination remediation for bunker gear, and the different sets of gear is kind of evolving. But where do you kind of see the front for some of this issue or some of these issues, or like topics where even though you're retired now, that the field can do better at, in your estimation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and as you said, it is evolving. We're being guided by the science. So we've got researchers that are looking at this. Here in Florida, we have Florida Firefighter Cancer Initiative. So the researchers are helping guide what we do practicality wise. But again, translating what we know into actions, we really need to be mindful on the front lines that we're being exposed to a tremendous amount of chemicals. So, the respiratory protection component is huge, and we need to have adherence to strict accountability for staying on air when we're anywhere near an environment that we are likely to be exposed to carcinogens. The gear, we know that carcinogens are being exposed to the gear and then ultimately through the gear onto our skin. So we have done some R&D and there's been improvements. The firefighter Nomex hoods, those now are designed with particulate blocking features, so they actually can block some of those carcinogens from getting through. But until such time as we have that same with the full set of gear, we need to just be mindful that decontamination now is not a nicety, it's a necessity. It's a matter of survival. So, and I'd be honest with you, I don't hear a lot of people. I think the industry now has acknowledged that, and we're implementing that. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about the rapidity, if you will, how quickly we do it. So, putting my EMS paramedic hat on, your listeners who are familiar with EMS will know, with stroke, we talk about time is brain. So the quicker we treat a stroke, the more brain we save. They'll know that with trauma, the quicker we can get them to surgery, the better the outcome is. With heart attack, we know the quicker we open the blocked coronary vessel, the better the survival of the heart. And think about it for firefighters now with decontamination. We know that the quicker we and more thorough that we can decontaminate, the less absorption of carcinogens we will have. So your likelihood of getting cancer will be lower. And, so I think that's the thing I don't necessarily see it being embraced in practice yet. And I think that's just cultural accountability. We've got some national campaigns out there which are wonderful. One of them is shower within the hour, which is trying to encourage firefighters when they get back to the station to thoroughly shower after every fire. But we really can't wait an hour. I mean, that's great to do a additional. I encourage the more decontamination, the better. But it needs to be point of contact as soon as we're out of that environment, and we need to go to work on removing all that carcinogen exposure from our skin, and then as part of that from our gear, because if we just put the gear back in the truck the way it is and throw it on for the next call, we're just repeatedly exposing ourselves to those carcinogens. So we're getting there. Really, it's a big ship to turn around. There's 1.3 million or so firefighters in the United States, 30 some odd thousand fire departments. I joke all the time, there's nothing homogenous about the fire service. I mean, so every department has its own nuances, but cancer doesn't pick and choose, and our exposures don't pick and choose. So we know, from certainly the NIOSH study, which is really the largest that's out there in the fire service, 30 some odd thousand firefighters from Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco. We know the reality that sits in front of us today is that firefighters have a higher prevalence of certain types of cancer. We also know that they're 14% higher mortality rate than other cancer out there that are non-firefighter. So we need to be strictly adherent to some of the practices and guidance that's evolving as best practice. And again, we're just in the short time you and I have today, we're just scratching the surface on this, right? So I encourage, again, I want to plug the Vector Solutions training on this exact topic, and encourage our listeners to follow that link that you're going to embed to take advantage of that.
Sure. And Todd, I always like to round out the interview with just like professional development topics, just different kind of questions that I always, as a trend, hit for the show. But one of them that I am interested in for you is to hear about your experience with professional societies and your involvement with different professional organizations. Because I can tell in my time talking with you that you've had a lot of it, and I would love to hear about, what kind of organizations you've been involved in and positions you've held and the value that you get out of this involvement.
Sure, absolutely, and thanks for asking that. One of the great opportunities I think with professional development is building a professional network of colleagues, and in particular, growing that network outside of your own backyard, which is how ideally change happens. Best practices are shared. So in my own experience, early on, I participated, was active in the local fire chiefs association. So in my case, that was Broward County Fire Chiefs, and then became active at the state level with the Florida Fire Chiefs Association. And ultimately ran for the board of directors for the International Association of Fire Chiefs, which their safety, health, and survival section. So that organization, which has been around since the 1800s, represents about 12,000 fire chiefs that are members, and has allowed me to not only represent the membership, but to tackle issues of national significance to the fire service. So whether that's lobbying on the Hill up in D.C. For legislative change for firefighters, whether that's supporting our wonderful, albeit small group of researchers that help shed light on some of the knowledge we need to affect change. Many of the topics we've discussed today. We've got a small group of researchers that always need more funding to help us as fire chiefs and firefighters to better understand what we can be doing to make it safer and more operationally impactful. And ultimately has allowed me to springboard into alliances with other national stakeholder organizations, such as my service on NFPA technical committee. I'm the chair of an advisory board for the First Responder Center of Excellence. So I would encourage, on a personal note for professional development, encourage your listeners. The day you stop learning is really the day that you need to reconsider your commitment to the profession. I consider myself a lifelong learner. So voracious reading, and certainly formal education. I benefited, no doubt, went on and received my master's degree in fire department leadership, organizational leadership. But it doesn't have to just be formal. I mean, simply staying up with the industry, reading the research that's coming out, being networked in at the local, the state, and the international level. You're often going to see emerging trends before others might see them. I'm a big proponent. I've been continue to be a peer reviewer for the Center for Public Safety Excellence, and that's the entity that not only accredits agencies, which forces the agency to be very mindful of their practices and pursue best practices. But they also credential fire officers and training officers and chief officers. So that actually is a process that once you go through it, it keeps you tuned up. And in order to keep it, requires you to continue to demonstrate core competencies and professional development. And that's a great network. When one accredited agency picks up the phone and calls another accredited agency and says, "Hey, can you share your on-scene decontamination SOGs, your standard operating guidelines?" That's kind of how an idea germinates, spreads, and I'm a big proponent of not recreating the wheel. I just did a wonderful webinar yesterday on this very topic. It was sponsored in part by Vector Solutions with Fire Engineering. But my co-presenter was Chief Frank Lieb, who's the safety chief for FDNY, Fire Department in New York. They've done some amazing things on-scene decontamination and exposure reduction, and they've got a whole. You can find it online. There's a whole booklet that they've put together to help share their practices. So here you've got the nation's largest fire department with 17,000 firefighters, able to focus on translating some of this strategy into action. So great resource out there for any of your listeners. But yeah, professional development is key, right? No matter what field you're in. In our industry, it may mean the difference between survival and non-survival. And that's even more critical.
Man, I appreciate that. That is a great bit of information on professional development. And what I've been saying to myself recently, and what I've heard other people say, is learners are earners, leaders are readers. And so I love what you said about how you need to question your commitment to your profession or whatever you're doing if you have decided to stop learning and to stop growing. I think that is a beautiful point.
Yeah, no, it's and I love that saying that you just shared with us as well. I had a wise mentor teach me to always outperform and outthink and out study. Um, again, in our profession, whether you're the nozzle person on the tip, or you're the chief of the department, if you stop that, you're ultimately putting yourself potentially in harm's way, not only development but survival. And we're a team profession, right? So we do everything typically on the fire ground as a team, and you're really compromising the rest of the team as well. So great quote there. And there is, I know sometimes people don't like to hear, professional development because it takes work. But if you're not doing it, you're setting yourself and others up for failure, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Todd, thanks so much. That's been such a great interview. But where can people find you? You mentioned your podcast, but what's the name of your podcast? Even though we'll add the link to it in the show
Sure.
notes.
So I want to give a shout out to my co-host and good friend, Dr. Donnie Hutchinson, and he does a weekly podcast as well. And then we do one together. So it's the Get Balanced podcast. Every Thursday, we do the Life Scan Learning Lab edition. We've had some tremendous friends on, everything from the U.S. Fire Administrator to the Superintendent of the U.S. Fire Academy on down the line. And I'm on social media, so you can follow and find me on Twitter at Todd J. LeDuc or on LinkedIn. And then if I can help anyone, feel free to email me. That's todd.leduc at life, Life, scan, wellness.com. And so I'm pretty accessible. I've got a little bit of a social media addiction, so don't hesitate to DM me or reach out on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to help with any of the topics we talked about. And again, take a little bit of time in your department, spread the word about those free courses that are available.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.